I've got a question. This whole thing about DUIs and Americans going to jail made me wonder, from what I've read of the jail and the criminal justice system over there, the jails are pretty nice compared to American jails. Did any Americans ever say, wow, that was a nice jail?
Well, I don't think anybody ever said it was a nice jail, but you know, I did get to visit several prisons while I was there. It's something we do as consular officers in the at the embassy, is we go visit American citizens who are in jail, either short-term or long-term. And I didn't hear any complaints about the jail. And what I would do is I would field questions. A lot of times somebody would be arrested, and I would be getting calls from their family in the US, and they would say, I heard my son or daughter or husband or wife is in this camp. Well, outside of the airport, there's a camp where they hold prisoners that are going to be deported. And so if you get in trouble when you show up in Norway, we had somebody who shoplifted in the airport. Well, they're not going to let you into Norway if you've already committed a crime. So they essentially sent them to this holding camp until they could get a flight and get deported out of Norway. So their family's calling saying, I heard they're in this camp. Well, I would tell them, you know, we visited the camp. It's not like a prison camp. There are locked doors, but they're essentially being held in a cell that's like a studio apartment. And you know, there's barbed wire around the camp, but it's not like they're in jail in Mexico. You know, all of my colleagues who have served in Mexico tell me about those jails, or jails that I visited in Serbia, where things are a lot rougher. So yes, I would say that life in jail is a lot better in Norway than it is in a lot of other places, to include the US. When I served in Serbia, before I even went to Norway, and I knew nothing about Norway at the time, but I was interviewing a Serbian who had been in prison in Norway, and we got to talking about it, and he told me, he said, you know, my prison cell in Norway was better than my apartment in Serbia. Now, again, you know, he wasn't a particularly rich Serbian, so I understand that, but and he was like a lot of foreigners, you know, if you get convicted of a crime, a serious crime, you serve your time in Norway, but when you are released, then you get deported back to your home country.
Did you find Americans were trying to find out how they could move to Norway and stay in Norway? Did you deal with that, Richard?
We got that question very frequently.
Yeah, figured.
You know, there's nothing we could do for them, and we couldn't really answer that. We would refer them to the appropriate Norwegian authorities, but you would get that question quite a bit. And I always got those questions informally in the church group or other groups of Americans that I would meet. They would say, you know, how does one move to Norway? Like, well, first you talk to the Norwegians, because we have nothing to do with that.
Richard, what can you tell us about the new ambassador to the U.S.?
What's her name again?
Anna starts with a K, Ketness or something.
Yeah.
Krutness.
Krutness. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You know, I'm the wrong person to ask. My friends who worked in the political section dealt with her quite a bit. Obviously, you know, she's very well known. But I will tell you that the relationship between the US and Norway is very complicated. It's great in some ways, and it's very strained in other ways. So what I know about her is that she is very familiar with the nuances of the US-Norwegian relationship. And she's very well respected and well known both in the US already by diplomats and business people, and she was seen as somebody, obviously, that the Norwegians thought could handle the rough and tumble of working in the DC area as a diplomat with this complicated relationship.
What is the primary thing that's complicated about that relationship?
Most people don't understand the importance of Norway. And I would say I didn't know the importance of Norway before I went there, to the United States and to NATO, and to really, not to overstate it, to the world, because of their unique relationship with Russia, both geographically and politically and historically, and in their unique relationship to the US, and because of where they are located strategically in the world. I would say that is the thing that makes it the most complicated, is that they're, as I said, a very small country with a very small population, but they are outsized importance in the political and military relationship for the United States. So I would say that's probably the most complicated. There's lots that's complicated about it, but I mean, pre-President Trump, pre everything that's going on right now, Norway has just been very strategic in this bridge between the East and the West, and the US and Russia, and with NATO and world peace, quite frankly. They're just a super important, super unique country in the world. And a lot of people don't know that. And only the people who work with that relationship understand how important and how nuanced it is.
Norway has a tremendous sports program. Very large number, percentage-wise, of Norwegians have won Olympic medals. Do you know why that would be? Why that happens?
Well, they do it, in winter sports, and they're not track and field stars, but certainly
But even things like soccer.
Yes, certainly soccer. But I watched the Olympics. It was a Winter Olympics while I was in Norway, so I watched, and of course it's just nonstop Norwegian cross-country skiing. Again, I think I would go back to what I mentioned about how they take holidays, because that also factors into how they view work-life balance. Because it's not just holidays. For a Norwegian, if they're done at 3:00, they're done at 3:00, and they have other things going on. They are not typically workaholics. They don't stay burning the midnight oil. This is not part of the culture. They do other things, and those other things that they do are often outdoors. So they are out hiking, early on. They're out cross-country skiing. When I learned to cross-country ski, and I'd be out there cross-country skiing. There's families out there with the kids in their little travois thing, being pulled by mom or dad, and they've also got their own skis when they can barely walk, but they're out there skiing already. And even hiking, when I hiked Bessigen, I was out there hiking, 8 hours. I was passed by every Norwegian on the mountain. I don't care if it was grandma or a little kid. Every single Norwegian on the mountain was going faster than me, and I'm not the slowest person in the world, but and I remember this one group that I talked to this guy about, maybe my age or so, but he's with a younger kid, his grandson. And I thought, well, I can beat them, and this guy's older than me, and this kid's a little kid, and we're sitting there talking. And I know I looked around about 30 minutes later, and they were nowhere in sight. They were just gone. So they're like little mountain goats on the mountain. And they're like, they're like fairies flying across the snow on their skis. And they're just out there in nature, in the outdoors, from as early as they can possibly be until they can't do it anymore physically. And so I think that contributes to it. They have the time to do it because they have work-life balance. and they just live outdoors. It is such a part of the culture to be outdoors that if you're not, kind of go back to that colleague that I mentioned who was lonely and didn't like Norway. If you don't like the outdoors, you're the odd person out in any group that you're in with Norwegians. If you say, I don't like to hike or ski, or I don't like to go out in the nature, they would probably not be your friend. You know, they wouldn't know how to relate to you. So I think that's what would contribute to it, is they're just out doing that so early and so often. And, you know, a lot of people will say also that Norwegians do the sports thing at an early age without competition, you know, without trophies, without having to be the best. They do it kind of more organically, like, we're just out here to play soccer. We're just out here for the sport. And yes, there are good ones, but there are bad ones. It doesn't matter. Everybody's out here. And if you're doing this, you're accepted into the group. So I think there's a little less pressure, and I think there's a little more opportunity to grow and just enjoy it. And then certainly figure out, hey, I have the ability to be world class. Those people go to a different level, but they were encouraged to do it from an early age, and they weren't turned off to being outdoors and doing a sport.
Mhm. But you mentioned Norway as being a very productive society. Do you think it's the fact that they have to get the job done within a certain period of time rather than putting things off? The fact that they don't take so many holidays, that gives them more productivity?
You mean Norwegians not
The-
taking holidays, or?
Taking holidays makes them more productive.
Well, you know, a lot of people say that if you take some time off, when you come back to work, you work harder and you're more productive, versus if you never take any time off and you're just kind of punching the clock. But, you know, I've heard people say that. You know, Norwegians are like anybody else. I'm trying to think of the Norwegians I worked with. You know, some are hard workers and get everything done, and some people are less so. But I do think that the fact that you are not burned out at work makes you more productive. And I think the fact that you know you've got a holiday coming up, you know you've got some time off, you know that nobody judges you for taking your holiday, does make you somebody who comes into work, you know you're only there for this amount of time, and you typically work pretty hard to get the job done. I didn't personally work with Norwegians that were lazy and said, you know, I'm going to get paid whether I work hard or not. I have a good life. I don't have to do that. Because you do hear Americans say that, and you hear, you know, if we talk about politics a little bit, you know, you hear people say that, you know, if you guarantee people a certain salary or you provide all this free stuff, they're not going to work as hard because they don't have to, you know, they've already got everything. I think that's certainly an individual choice, but I think in general, most Norwegians that I can think of, that I knew well enough to be able to think about knowing their opinion, they just felt very fortunate to live in the society they lived in the environment they lived in. And they worked pretty hard because they felt that they were blessed to live there. Now, having said that, I will say there's some Norwegians, you know, some especially younger Norwegians that you know, can't imagine any other life. And if you talk to the older Norwegians that remember when Norway was poor, when Norway was, you know, before oil, when they were poor, after World War II, when they were poor and, you know, hungry, and you really had to work hard, it's kind of like a Depression era American, you know, grandma or grandpa who lived through the Depression, talking to the younger kids who have never seen a day where they had to want for anything. So there is a little bit of that dichotomy. Older Norwegians know what it's like to not have everything, and the younger Norwegians, this is just their life. It's always been this way. It always will be this way. And it's just, sometimes they take that for granted a little bit. This is just preordained. And I think, if I go back again to a little bit of how I see Americans, there are some Americans that are that way as well. When I said they have this fascination with freedom, they just take for granted that America will always be this great country. That's been shaken a little bit, with COVID and a few other things. But the Depression era parents and grandparents, understand that. Like, hey, you know what? Life can change on a dime, and it's not always perfect, and you've got to be prepared and you got to be resilient. Older Norwegians understand that. Older Americans understand that. It's very easy if you're young and things have always been good in your life to take that for granted.
Can I say something about that? And I agree with you, Richard. I think in the US, you have a generation called millennials. You know what we call that generation in Norwegian? We call them the dessert generation. So these are the people who are getting the dessert. And everybody who came before had that mentality of working hard. But now we see the same is happening in Norway as happened in the US. And I'm not saying that the millennials are not hard workers, but they have a different view of the world. And we call them the dessert generation in Norway.
Oh.
So things have changed. But
Yeah.
you're right. People will put in work during those 7.5 hours a day that we work in Norway. And then we play and do
then
the fun stuff and be with our families. You're very right about that. We have you finish work, you're done. We don't care. If somebody calls us from the American Embassy 5 to 4 asking for a meeting, we say, I'll catch you tomorrow. Because we have to be out of there at 4. They can wait, right?
Yeah.
But
We would get that with Norwegians and the Norwegian government. Like, hey, we have to have this meeting. Like, well, not today.
Yeah.
Anyone else have questions? I'd like to.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I'm sure Norwegians see a lot of American television and movies, and that may be how they learn about the United States. What sort of questions do they ask you about the United States, Norwegians ask?
I talked to a lot of Norwegians who traveled in the US, so even those that traveled in the US, I could guess 9 times out of 10 where they had traveled to: New York, Miami, Las Vegas, Minnesota, if they had Norwegian, if they had American relatives and roots. So, they all thought they kind of knew something about America, but I think they would.
Can I bring you anything?
No.
They mostly would ask how much you liked Norway, how much better. In some way they were trying to say, like, don't you think Norway is better than the US? If I was hiking in Jotunheimen, and I was at a D&T cabin, it would be, what do you think of the Norwegian nature? Because they want you to say, well, Norwegian nature is much better than the US. But, so they would often ask questions to get that comparison between the US and Norway, with an idea that, hey, we know Norway is better, but, what do you think? But they also would ask questions about, how do Americans, drive so much? Or how come Americans don't speak another language? Or, they couldn't figure out how come Americans were so different from Europeans. And even if they'd traveled in the US, and a lot of them liked the US, I talked to, exchange students who had been in the US who had loved their experience, wanted to go back and visit their host parents, people who had studied in the US in university, people that were married to Americans. But I think they most of their questions revolved around, why do Americans think that they are so separate and unique and special, and they don't have this sense of collective participation in the world? Why do you think you can dictate to the rest of the world as opposed to cooperate with the rest of the world? Again, pre-Trump, pre the current political climate. And I think that's when things were going better in the EU, and before, EU people started to talk about Brexit and some of those things. But I just think that Norwegians have a unique sense of, we're special. Don't get me wrong, they feel like they're special and wonderful and in some ways better than other people, but they also know that they have a role in the world and in Europe, and they know that being connected to that is very important. And they feel like Americans don't have that same feeling. And so a lot of their questions were about that. Why are Americans so arrogant and standoffish as a country, not people?
What
Yeah,
American TV shows and books and movies are particularly popular in Norway? Or hard to say?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think it's really everything. As somebody mentioned, that's how they know about America, is from seeing that. But it's also why they speak English so well. I would talk to Norwegians who had not a trace of an accent. Not that a Norwegian accent is huge, but and I remember talking to Norwegians that hadn't even traveled to the U.S. and I'd say, "How come why do you speak just like an American?" Like, I watch a lot of TV, so I think it's more just volume, because America pumps out so much of TV and movies, that they watch a lot of it, and they watch it from the very beginning. So a Norwegian is exposed to English from day one, versus the typical American who, if they learn a foreign language, is exposed to it, maybe certainly in high school, maybe sometime before that, if their family has some connection to another language, or, wants them to learn another language. But, a lot of them, not even till college. They just don't get exposed to a foreign language until so much later in life, versus a Norwegian who's been exposed to English from, literally day one.
Wait, when you're talking about TV in Norway, I find it kind of interesting, because there's a lot of TV in the US that I don't understand why people watch it. But the Norwegians like those shows that maybe it shows a train going and it's just showing the train going down the track, and they'll watch that for hours. And there's other
Yes.
shows like that.
Yeah, slow TV. I know they call it that. I'm not sure Inger could answer that question of why they like that, but I do think the slow TV that I've seen has always been kind of connected to nature, and it's just that whole idea that this is calming. This is what the real world is about, is this connection to nature and getting back to who we are as human beings and our connection to nature.
It's
And
Dave, it's a new phenomenon. It's maybe 5 years old, something like that. And you're right, it has been a lot about nature. And it's sort of what Norwegians have on in the background while they're doing something else. Because who wants to watch 20 hours of looking at reindeers in real life? This is like real-time TV, So you don't sit there like, oh, this is exciting, but it's very comforting and nice. And you have the nature in the background. And somehow you didn't think it would be a big hit, but it turned out that so many Norwegians were tuning into this. So I think that's a proof of we need something slow in our very fast lives these days. And in Norway too.
It's a good point. Yep. Okay, if there aren't any
Uh,
other
yeah.
questions, Bill,